In the spring of 1942, on the war-torn Crimean Peninsula, the Germans unleashed a weapon so enormous that the soldiers who saw it could barely believe it was real. It was a cannon, but to call it a cannon does it no justice at all. It stood as tall as a 4-story building, it stretched longer than a football pitch, and it weighed more than 1,000 fully grown blue whales. It fired shells the size of small cars, hurling them across distances of more than 30 kilometres. It needed its own railway, its own private army of thousands of men, and several weeks just to be assembled. This was the Schwerer Gustav, the largest gun ever used in the history of warfare. To understand just how absurd this machine was, picture it for a moment. Imagine a single gun so heavy that it weighed as much as a small warship. Imagine a barrel so wide that a grown man could almost climb inside it. Imagine a shell so large that it stood taller than the soldiers who loaded it, and so heavy that a single one weighed as much as a fully loaded truck. Now imagine that this entire colossus had to be carried to the battlefield on its own special train, reassembled by hundreds of men over several days, and rolled along a curving railway just to be aimed. This was not a weapon in any ordinary sense. It was a moving fortress of steel, an entire industrial project pointed at a single target. And this is the story of how Nazi Germany built a machine so vast that the rest of the world refused to believe it could possibly exist. The origins of the Schwerer Gustav reach back to the years before the Second World War, to a problem that haunted the German military planners. Along the border between Germany and France stood the Maginot Line, a chain of immense concrete fortresses that the French had built to be utterly impregnable. These forts were buried in steel and reinforced concrete, some of it metres thick, sunk deep into the earth and bristling with guns. They had been designed after the horrors of the First World War to make absolutely certain that a German army could never again pour across the French frontier. German commanders studied these fortifications carefully, and what they learned filled them with dread. Their existing artillery, even their heaviest guns, could never hope to crack such defences open. The problem was a simple one of physics and steel. If Germany was ever going to smash through that wall of fortifications, it would need a weapon unlike anything that had ever been built. It would need a gun powerful enough to punch through 7 metres of solid reinforced concrete, or a full metre of hardened steel armour plate, and it would need to do so from far beyond the range of any French gun that could shoot back. The German planners, studying details of the Maginot Line that had even appeared in French newspapers, slowly came to a sobering conclusion. No weapon then in existence could do the job. If they wanted such a weapon, they would have to invent it from nothing, and it would have to be the most powerful gun the world had ever seen. The German Army High Command turned to the one company in the world they believed could attempt such a thing. That company was Krupp, the legendary heavy industry empire based in the city of Essen, a firm with a long and infamous history of building the cannons of war. Krupp had supplied the guns of the German armies for generations, including the famous Big Bertha howitzers of the First World War, and if any company on Earth could build an impossible cannon, it was this one. In 1934, Krupp was asked to prepare ballistics reports for a series of enormous guns, firing shells of 70, 80, 85, and even 100 centimetres in width. The goal was always the same: to fire from outside the enemy's range and to shatter the thickest fortifications ever built. The task of designing this weapon fell to a brilliant Krupp engineer named Erich Müller, and the numbers he came back with were almost beyond belief. To do what the army wanted, Müller calculated, would require a gun with a barrel around 80 centimetres wide, firing a shell weighing 7 tonnes from a barrel roughly 30 metres long. The whole weapon would weigh more than 1,000 tonnes. It was a monster on paper, and many doubted it could ever be built at all. The size and weight were so extreme that the gun could not possibly move on roads or on a single railway. It would have to be carried on twin sets of railway tracks laid side by side, and it could only be aimed from side to side by rolling the entire gigantic machine along a curve in the rails. For a time, nothing happened. The plans for the giant gun simply sat unrealized, too ambitious and too expensive to pursue in earnest. Then, in 1936, everything changed because of a single visit. Adolf Hitler came to the Krupp works in Essen, and during that visit he personally asked about the feasibility of the giant guns. When the leader of Nazi Germany takes a personal interest in a weapon, things begin to move very quickly. Although Hitler gave no firm commitment at first, design work soon began in earnest on an 80-centimetre model. The plans were completed in early 1937 and approved, and the fabrication of the first gun began in the middle of that year. The dream of the impossible cannon was finally becoming real, and Hitler would later come to regard the finished weapon almost with affection, reportedly calling it his steel fist. Building the Schwerer Gustav proved to be one of the greatest engineering challenges of the entire war. The sheer scale of the thing defeated every normal expectation. Forging pieces of steel that massive was so difficult that the original completion date of early 1940 had to be abandoned entirely. The metalworkers of Krupp were pushing the very limits of what human industry could achieve, wrestling with single components that weighed more than entire locomotives. The barrel alone was a marvel and a nightmare to produce. A tube of hardened steel over 30 metres long that had to be perfectly formed to survive the unimaginable pressures of firing a 7-tonne shell. Every part of the gun existed at a scale that ordinary factories had never been built to handle. A test model was built in late 1939 and sent to a proving ground, where its monstrous power was finally demonstrated. Firing at a high angle, that enormous 7-tonne shell smashed through the full 7 metres of concrete it had been designed to defeat, and through a full metre of steel armour plate as well. The weapon worked exactly as Erich Miller had calculated years before. When the trials were completed, the complex carriage that would carry and aim the gun was developed further, and in the spring of 1941, the formal acceptance trials were held at a proving ground on the Baltic coast. Adolf Hitler himself came to watch. Standing alongside his armaments officials as the giant fired, he was reportedly awestruck by what he saw. The weapon worked. The only question now was whether Germany could ever actually find a use for it. The finished Schwerer Gustav was a machine that strains the imagination even today. Fully assembled, it weighed around 1,350 tons. It stretched roughly 47 metres in length, it stood about 11 metres tall, and its colossal barrel measured over 30 metres long. Its calibre, the width of its barrel, was 80 centimetres, far larger than any gun ever used in battle before or since. To fire it, the crew loaded shells that defied belief. The armour-piercing shell weighed around 7 tonnes on its own, roughly the weight of an elephant, and it could be flung to a range of about 38 kilometres. The lighter high-explosive shell weighed almost 5 tonnes and could travel even further, reaching targets some 47 kilometres away. A single one of these shells was taller than a man. Moving such a weapon presented a problem that almost defies description. The gun was so vast that it could never travel in one piece. To get it anywhere, it had to be broken down into separate units and carried on a long train of special railway wagons. The barrel alone was split into 2 halves. The breech, the cradle, the great trunnions, and the enormous carriage were all carried separately. The carriage itself divided lengthwise into 2 halves so that it could fit through the tunnels and past the obstacles of an ordinary railway. When the Schwerer Gustav travelled to war, the train that carried it stretched to around 25 cars and reached a total length of about 1.5 kilometres. The gun was so heavy that it could not run on a single railway track. Instead, it needed a specially built double track laid side by side, engineered to bear its monstrous weight, and to aim it from side to side, the entire gun had to be rolled along a curving section of that track. There was no other way to point it at a target. Assembling the weapon at its firing position was a feat of organisation as much as engineering. Once all the gigantic components arrived near the front, great cranes running on their own outer tracks lifted the pieces into place. The gun was built up from the bottom upward, layer by layer, like some vast mechanical cathedral rising from the earth. This was not the work of hours but of days, a slow and laborious process that left the weapon completely exposed and vulnerable while it was being put together. An enemy who knew where the gun was being assembled could, in theory, have destroyed it before it ever fired a shot, which is exactly why so many men and so much anti-aircraft protection were devoted to guarding it. Operating the Schwerer Gustav required something closer to an army than a gun crew. To assemble the weapon and prepare it for firing took a core crew of around 250 men, and even they needed several days of work to put it together. But that was only the beginning. To lay the special tracks, to build the embankments, to guard the position, and to handle all the supporting work, the full operation could involve somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 personnel. An entire German artillery unit, numbering over 1,400 men, was created for the single purpose of deploying this one weapon. 2 anti-aircraft battalions were assigned just to protect it from attack from the sky. The gun was so important, and so vulnerable, that it travelled with its own private army. Just loading and firing a single shell was a major operation, and the weapon could manage only about 1 shot every hour at best. The weapon was given its famous name in honour of an old man at the very top of the Krupp Empire. It was christened Schwerer Gustav, meaning Heavy Gustav, after Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the senior head of the firm. In keeping with an old Krupp tradition, the company asked for no payment at all for this first gun. It was presented to the German war effort as a gift. The artillerymen, who actually worked on the weapon, however, had a less reverent name for it. They began calling it Dora, a nickname that stuck so firmly that for many years afterward people were confused about how many of these guns had even been built, wondering whether Gustav and Dora were one weapon or two. By the time the Schwerer Gustav was finally ready for war, the situation it had been designed for had completely vanished. The gun had been created to smash the forts of the Maginot Line, but when Germany invaded France in 1940, the weapon was not yet ready. It did not matter, because the German army simply went around the Maginot Line, sweeping through Belgium and the Low Countries and outflanking the great French fortresses entirely. The famous defensive wall, which had cost France a fortune, and which the Schwerer Gustav had been born to destroy, was bypassed almost without a fight. France fell through speed and maneuver, not through brute force against concrete. The most powerful gun ever conceived had been built to destroy a wall that the war had already made irrelevant. There is a deep irony at the heart of this. The Schwerer Gustav was a weapon designed for the static, fortress-bound warfare of the past, conceived in the shadow of the trenches of the First World War. But the Second World War, at least in its opening years, was a war of movement, of fast tanks and aircraft and rapid advances. A gun that took weeks to set up and could barely be moved was almost the opposite of what this new kind of warfare demanded. The weapon now existed, fully formed and monstrously powerful, but it had no purpose. It was a brilliant answer to a question that nobody was asking anymore. A new target was found far to the east, in the Soviet Union. In 1942, deep into the brutal war on the Eastern Front, the Germans laid siege to the heavily fortified port city of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. Here at last was a target worthy of the giant gun. A city ringed with powerful Soviet coastal fortresses, deep underground defences, and ammunition stores buried beneath rock and concrete. And so the Schwerer Gustav began its enormous journey eastward, hauled across a continent toward the Crimea. The gun travelled first to the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow neck of land leading into the peninsula, where it was held for weeks. A special railway spur line had to be built to bring the gun within range of Sevastopol, branching off the main line some 16 kilometres north of the target. At the end of this spur, engineers laid out a great curve of 4 semicircular tracks with outer tracks for the cranes that would assemble the weapon. Preparing the position took weeks of grueling labour by thousands of men, building embankments, laying the heavy double track, and slowly raising the gun into place. By the early days of June, the impossible cannon stood ready to fire its first shot in anger. It had taken years of design, a fortune in money and steel, and an entire small army of soldiers and labourers to bring this single weapon to this single spot on the map. The siege of Sevastopol was about to become the only true test the Schwerer Gustav would ever face. The one moment when all that staggering effort would finally be unleashed upon a living enemy. What followed at Sevastopol was the only true combat the Schwerer Gustav would ever see, and for a few days it lived up to its terrifying promise. Beginning on the 5th of June 1942, the gun opened fire on the Soviet fortifications. Its first targets were coastal artillery positions, which it destroyed after just a handful of shots. Then it turned its barrel on a complex of concrete fortifications known to the Germans as the Stalin Fortress, reducing it to rubble with only a few of its enormous shells. But the most famous moment came on the 6th of June. The gun fired upon a Soviet ammunition magazine known as White Cliff, a store of explosives buried deep beneath a bay, protected by water, by earth, and by around 10 metres of concrete. The giant armour-piercing shell punched down through all of it and detonated the magazine in an enormous explosion. A weapon buried 30 metres below the surface had been destroyed from kilometres away, and the blast was so violent that at least one ship in the bay was reportedly sunk by the shockwaves of nearby impacts. For the soldiers on both sides, the spectacle of the Schwerer Gustav in action was almost beyond comprehension. Each shot produced a thunderous roar and a recoil so immense that it could be felt through the ground far away. The shells themselves, taller than a man and weighing as much as an elephant, screamed through the sky toward their targets, guided by spotter aircraft that watched from above and corrected the gun's aim. When one of these monstrous projectiles struck home, the destruction was total at the point of impact, throwing up vast craters and obliterating anything nearby. For a few days at Sevastopol, the giant gun seemed to justify every impossible hope that had been poured into it. Yet for all this destruction, the Schwerer Gustav was already revealing itself to be a deeply impractical weapon. Over the course of the siege, the gun fired a total of around 48 rounds at Sevastopol. In doing so, it completely wore out its barrel, which had already fired some 250 shells during testing and development. The accuracy was poor for such a colossal effort. Of the 48 rounds fired, only about 10 landed within 60 metres of their targets, and one shot missed by hundreds of metres. The gun could fire only about one shell every hour. For all the thousands of men, the special railways, and the weeks of preparation, the Schwerer Gustav was an enormously expensive way to deliver a single devastating blow and little more. When you weigh the cost against the result, the verdict becomes harsh. Sevastopol did eventually fall, but it fell after a long and bloody siege in which countless ordinary guns fired hundreds of thousands of shells. The Schwerer Gustav's 48 rounds, however spectacular, were a tiny fraction of that effort. The same destruction could have been achieved by smaller, cheaper, more mobile weapons that did not require their own railway, and an army of 2,000 men. Every hour that the giant gun spent being assembled, aimed, and reloaded was an hour in which the vast resources tied up in it could have been doing far more useful work elsewhere. The weapon was a triumph of engineering and a failure of common sense. A machine that impressed everyone who saw it and helped almost no one who used it. After Sevastopol, the giant gun faded quickly from the stage of history. Its worn barrel was replaced and the original sent back to Krupp for repair. The weapon was dismantled and moved north toward the city of Leningrad, where another great siege was underway and another attack was planned. The Schwerer Gustav was positioned and made fully ready near a railway station outside the city, but the assault was cancelled before the gun could fire a single shot. It spent the winter sitting idle near Leningrad, a colossal monument to wasted effort, its barrel pointed at a target it would never be allowed to strike. Its sister gun, the second weapon often associated with the name Dora, saw even less use. It was sent towards Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942 and placed some distance west of the city, with plans to bombard it. But as the catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad turned decisively against Germany, the gun was hastily packed up and withdrawn before it could play any meaningful part. It may never have fired a shot in genuine combat at all. There was even a third giant in the family, a planned version with an enormously long barrel intended to throw a shell across vast distances, but it was never finished, damaged by Allied bombing while still under construction. The dream of the supergun was collapsing under its own impossible weight. The end of the Schwerer Gustav was as anticlimactic as the rest of its career had been spectacular. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany and Allied armies closed in from east and west, the giant guns became nothing more than enormous liabilities. The first gun was eventually captured by American soldiers, who found it cut up and abandoned. The second gun was deliberately destroyed by the Germans themselves near the end of the war, blown apart to prevent it from falling into the hands of the advancing Soviet Red Army. The ruins of one of these monsters were discovered in a forest in Germany in April of 1945. The largest gun ever built had ended its life not in a blaze of glory, but as a heap of twisted steel scrap, deliberately wrecked and left behind. When Allied technical experts came to examine the shattered remains, even the scrap was enough to astonish them. The reports of a German gun of this size had seemed almost too fantastic to be true, the kind of rumor that spreads in wartime and is usually dismissed as exaggeration. Surely, many had thought, no one would actually build a cannon that needed its own railway and an army to operate. And yet now here was the proof. Lying broken in the dirt of a German forest, the twisted steel of a weapon that had genuinely existed. The men who measured those ruins could finally confirm what had seemed impossible. The giant gun had been real all along. Today almost nothing of the Schwerer Gustav survives. The guns themselves were destroyed and melted down long ago, their steel scattered and lost. What remains are only a few of the gigantic shells, preserved as relics in museums in places such as the United Kingdom and Poland. One of these enormous shells stands on display beside a Soviet tank, dwarfing the armoured vehicle next to it, and giving visitors a small sense of the scale of the weapon that once fired it. To stand beside one of these surviving shells, dwarfed by a single piece of ammunition, is the closest anyone today can come to grasping the true size of the machine that launched it across the sky. The gun is gone, but the shells endure, silent witnesses to an age when men built engines of war on a scale that now seems almost mythical. The Schwerer Gustav deserves to be remembered as one of the most extraordinary and yet most pointless machines of the entire Second World War. It was a genuine engineering marvel, a triumph of raw industrial ambition, the largest and heaviest mobile artillery piece ever built, and the gun that fired the heaviest shells in the history of warfare, and yet it achieved almost nothing of real strategic value. It required thousands of men, a private railway, and weeks of preparation, all to fire a few dozen shells in a single siege. It was a weapon born from the belief that bigger must always mean better, a belief that the war would prove tragically and repeatedly wrong. The Schwerer Gustav was a monument to overreach, a steel giant that promised to win wars and instead consumed vast resources for a handful of spectacular but hollow victories. In the end, the story of the Schwerer Gustav is the story of an idea taken to its most absurd extreme. Nazi Germany built a cannon so large that it strained the limits of engineering, transport, and common sense alike. The rest of the world, hearing whispers of a gun that could throw a 7-tonne shell across 30 kilometres, could hardly bring itself to believe such a thing existed. But it did exist, however briefly, a true colossus of steel that fired its shells over the ruins of Sevastopol before vanishing almost as suddenly as it had appeared. It remains, to this day, the largest gun mankind has ever turned upon itself in war, a record that one can only hope will never be broken.